we all have a short time on this planet, and if we spend it worrying about who wins an Oscar, you might as well put a gun in your mouth.
Hey, look, you guys got me to 5,000 subscribers. What a beautiful bit of Oscar symmetry to be talking about the 5th Oscar special, or 6th, depending on who you ask.
6th? No, last year didn't count. That was bullshit.
I've seen a whole lot of love for this special in the comments. I think it's safe to say it's a fan favorite, and for good reason. I do not even have to go and take a recess to declare this my 2nd favorite Oscar special.
Is this made to look like an old sea shanty?
If I find myself scrolling through all the Oscar specials on the High Network looking for one to watch, this is probably my most common go-to. It's hilariously funny, and beyond that has so much interesting character work and great drama. It's such a lived-in universe. This thing has been snowballing since the beginning, getting to a point where, for lack of a better word, it just feels epic, because it is. The more history there is, the more there is to pull from and expand on. The more character development there is, the more real it all feels. It really starts to feel unstoppable comedically, like a perpetual motion machine that somehow only gets faster and more complex. And to me, this special is just one of the great comedic masterpieces of all time. Anyway, at this point, we got 4.5 Oscar specials in the can, 3 historic Hobbit snubs, a few cake flops, a few meltdowns, and the team is back with a banger of a special that includes some really important lore moments with enormous implications to the universe going forward. The inception of Judge Joe, the introduction of the Delgado Fund, but also some really shocking twists, turns, and surprises. I'm sure you know the enormous one that I'm talking about, so as usual, let's get it out of the way right now. You see, Hank explains that in the 2 years between the 4th and 5th annual, he was involved in a lawsuit with Chaplins Chili founder Tom Chaplin, resulting in Chaplins Chili acquiring the rights to Chaplin soups and subs. CSS, as I'm sure you remember, was the most recent iteration of the Chaplins brand, born from Tom Chaplin's distaste for a proposed new expanded menu and the intervention of one Levinson's acquisitions group. Thankfully for Hank, Levinson's is a famously loyal acquisitions group and continued its investment in Hank's talents for cooking chili-adjacent bean-based soups.
And
This allowed him to grow his business under a new name, Chaplin's Express, and grow it did. By the time of the 5th annual, Hank has seen to the creation of a whopping 34 franchise locations inside gas stations in Southern California and one in Arizona. But this time it's different. With this new iteration of the business, chilies and chowders are nowhere to be found. Instead, travelers refueling their cars are invited to also refuel their bodies with Vape Lounge vapes and a bowl of 5-bean stew.
That chili tastes different because it's stew now, or?
no,
Yes,
don't
it's
get
an
into that,
all-new-
Joe.
Chaplin's Express also made history by inventing the world's first stew dog.
We could put the stew right on the dog.
This comes on Chaplin's special recipe for hot dog, which is made fresh in their factory every morning. Though the quality of these hot dogs are met with mixed reviews, even from the same person only a few minutes apart.
Chaplin's Express hot dogs are very
The
good. That's hot dog is awful.
You can't argue with 35 locations and the smiles on the faces of the Oscar crew as they dig in. We'll continue to cover the spicy landscape of the chili, chowder, and stew industry right here on this channel, so stick around.
I wish we had any other sponsor. I'd take Durex condoms. I'd take NRA. I'd take anything over you.
But there's some other stuff that happens in this one too. All the classics are here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all enjoy watching the Oscars. That's why we're here watching this show.
Tim is drinking.
Got a little rummy in my tummy.
The Oscar talk is as surface level and inane as always.
I don't know, because I don't know what's going on the Oscars.
Gregg claims definitively that he has an inside scoop on the Oscars and that he'll be revealing winners before the actual Oscars do. And that goes about the way you'd expect.
Gregg has a exclusive Oscar
No, sorry,
pick.
it's somebody else.
He just always needs to pretend that he knows more about movies than anyone else. Otherwise, he has nothing. And the lengths that he goes to try and cultivate that persona is amazing.
Your inside guy is no good.
No, because then maybe that's the bad information.
I thought that was a sure thing.
Yeah, Gregg.
Call me
why
by
don't we
your
go
name.
to
There are hilarious new segments such as the Super Oscars pitting all the most recent Oscar winners against each other to find the best one, which Gregg is clearly rigged in favor of Lord of the Rings, given it was the one card he had a bigger version of. There are guest segments like the return of D. Thompson, which is funny but not particularly memorable. But God, I absolutely have to mention the incredible segue into this segment in which Gregg makes a joke about alcoholism, and Tim introduces D by saying this.
It's not a disease anyone should be laughing at. One disease that I never laugh at is the great D. Thompson.
This had to be an improvised moment. It's so quick, and Tim just plays it off as if it made any sense at all to introduce a guest by actually saying that he's a disease. It feels like one of those moments where you try to say something clever as soon as you think of it, but then as soon as you say it, you realize it doesn't make any sense. It's just such a weird thing to say that only he would come up with, and it's one of those on-cinema quotes that just sticks in my head like crazy for some reason. Speaking of Tim, we also get the classic name drop and then full heel turn into shit-talking, but this time with Tim bizarrely suggesting that Billy Graham is speaking to him from beyond the grave.
Reverend Billy Graham is here tonight. He's talking to me in my head. I think Billy Graham is in hell.
I have no idea where Tim telling this bizarre lie about having been the last person to speak to Billy Graham came from.
And then I found out that I was the last person to talk to him, which is pretty cool.
But the idea of the last words you ever hear this Tim Heidecker character saying fuck you is harrowing.
I was so angry at him. I said the F word to him. I said F you, but I said F-U-C-K-U to him and hung up the phone.
And I get a good laugh out of it. But much like the 4th annual, there's a very dark cloud hanging over the Broadcast West studio in Culver City. This is the first time we saw these characters again after Tim was put on trial for murder, since Tim's closest colleagues and friends testified against him with varying degrees of brutal honesty.
He'll bop me.
I remember being really excited to see how this would play out. It was a chance for everyone to come back together and regroup after such a tumultuous event in their relationships. I expected it to go poorly, and I wasn't disappointed in that regard. Thankfully, right before he died, Billy Graham convinced Tim that he should forgive those around him, which is why there's some initial civility, but he can't hide his anger for long. What else do you expect when the man who was just recently accused of killing 19 kids has to try and bury his resentment for everyone around him on a drunken live stream?
I had to watch Gregg, Mark Proksch, almost like in the Bible, the character of Judas, how he turned his back on everybody.
This immediately apparent animosity adds an extra layer to the usual element of starting an Oscar special in an energetic and excited way as if everything's okay and it's going to go great, and us knowing that it's going to completely fall apart by the end. And fall apart completely it does. Year after year, here are these weird, emotionally stunted people doing the exact same thing and making the exact same mistakes. But the way it happens and all the nonsense they stuff the show with is always surprising and creative. And this time, it's all about Jaws.
What an exciting year it is for the Jaws family. Jaws the shark and all the rest. I need some Jaws sugar.
Jaws 2 is the best. Jaws 1 is the second best. Jaws 4 is the third best.
Happy birthday to Jaws. Happy birthday to Jaws. Oh, Lordy, guess who's 40? Jaws 2 is 40. Hip hip hooray! I think it was a big mistake to center the entire night around Jaws. That's my honest opinion.
The idea of theming an Oscar show around Jaws 2 is just so funny to me. Not even the first Jaws, because they missed their opportunity for a Jaws anniversary that's divisible by 10, I guess. And then everything they do that's Jaws related is just so surface level and corny and terrible. Like Gregg bragging about how his suit isn't just the suit of an eccentric gentleman, but a living Jaws movie poster.
Look at the red from the Jaws 2. And then this represents the shark itself and the water.
The idea that anyone would see him wearing this and realize that they've seen it before on the poster for Jaws because of the color scheme, as Gregg suggests, is so absurd. It's Gregg assuming that literally anyone else's brain would work in the way his does, which is always funny.
Your tie sucks.
Or the long montage of random people wishing Jaws 2 a happy 40th anniversary.
You're the best. Happy anniversary.
All the way from across the pond, happy 40th anniversary.
It's such a weird and hollow and pointless thing that no one else would think to do, but it's played as so sincere and celebratory.
Almost got a little choked up there.
It reminds me a lot of an only slightly less ridiculous version of that whole 100 Years of Jackie Chan sketch from Awesome Show.
I love you, Jackie Chan, and congratulations on 100 years.
But like the 2.0 version that works way better because it's in context. And the rest of the Jaws 2 stuff is outright disastrous, like Mark's impersonations, which literally aren't even from Jaws 2.
You all know me. You know how I make a living. This is a bad fish.
These are actually my pick for the outright funniest part of the special. I find myself trying to show people these moments specifically as an example of the kind of hilarity of on cinema that's more so on the surface. Mark Pork is just so great at playing this pathetic character that tries so hard and fails so miserably time after time. He plays dim and simple better than anyone out there.
He tries to inject the Jaws.
I always ask myself, why would this person of all people think that they are equipped for this line of work? But then again, why would Tim or Gregg think they were equipped to do anything they do? It's my favorite example of Mark's impersonations enraging Tim.
This is Quint from Jaws you're doing? He talks like this, like a pirate. Why can't you talk like a fucking pirate? I'm instantly regretting asking you to be a part of this.
As always, Tim goes into it knowing that he's not going to like it, and yet hypes Mark up as such a talented performer. And after all that hype, barely lets him even try before freaking out on him.
Shark came out.
What the fuck is your problem? I told you to sit down. Sit down. Sit down. The character sits. Be smart.
If you want to
Are you
catch a,
riffing?
if you want to catch
This
a,
isn't W.C. Fields, dummy.
Every word Mark says is just hilarious. He really plays it more beaten down and sad than ever here. That's a space that he thrives in, and he always makes it amazingly funny. I talk a lot about what amazing performers Tim and Gregg are, but goddamn, Mark is a star. His shy, sunken, insecure way of trying to deliver a monologue is just so perfect with his strange, awkward affect.
Do the fucking action, dummy. Come on.
USS Indianapolis. 2 torpedoes took us down.
He looks so embarrassed and defeated, especially as Tim constantly cuts him off and tells him he's doing it wrong.
And I don't know if I'm doing it right.
You're not
forgot.
doing it right.
I love the detail that Mark protests that Tim wouldn't let him do the Little Rascals.
He wouldn't let me do my classic comedians, the Little Rascals.
Here's the thing.
Didn't realize he had that in his repertoire, and I'd love to see it. And it also includes my favorite Mark and Tim moment ever, in which Mark, as a desperate attempt of salvaging this performance in Tim's eyes, tries to communicate a fact that he knows about Jaws.
Roy Scheider was one of the only to come back for Jaws 2.
All right, you can know all the trivia you want for Jaws.
Because as we know, especially after the Our Cinema Oscar special, that's how he prepares for his performances.
Give me a few minutes, though, because I need to look up some facts.
But obviously the big headline here is what happens in his final Jaws segment, and believe me, we'll get to all that later. On paper, bringing back an actor from Jaws 2 to interview him about the movie is actually the kind of thing that would make sense for a show like this, even though I'm not sure how many people would really care to hear an interview of one of the teenagers from Jaws 2. Either way, they get points for the premise, but of course they handle it so spectacularly poorly. It's one of my favorite moments of just pure dysfunction because Gregg is so interested and Tim is immediately rude to him.
So why was Jaws 2 such a flop?
The best bit is when a drunk and impatient Tim keeps trying to shut down the interview, storming off the set and talking loudly, and then at one point actually starts conducting his own separate interview with the Rat Pack guys as Gregg is trying to talk to the guy about Jaws 2.
I'm tired of this.
Is called Jaws 2.
Don Cheadle, you
Because
ever
they
worked
took
with
the characters,
Richard Dreyfuss?
and Spielberg was going to direct Jaws 2, and he did, but it was called
Really?
Close Encounters of the
How
Third
about you,
Kind.
Deanie boy?
And they got rid of the shark.
This poor guy can't even get a word in with Gregg, who won't stop interrupting him to go on and on and on about Richard Dreyfuss and how Close Encounters of the Third Kind is the real Jaws 2. And then the cherry on top is Tim trying to get the last word and trying to pretend that he was the good guy all along by suddenly flip-flopping and being all nice to the guy.
Jaws 2 should have been called Jaws 3.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I didn't know that.
Thank you, Keith. You're welcome to stick around. You're a nice guy. You stick around.
These kinds of dynamics between Tim and Gregg and their guests sometimes hit these grooves where it just feels like everything is on autopilot and working perfectly like clockwork, where these characters just take on a life of their own. And this is definitely one of those moments for me, where you really notice just how fucking good at this Tim and Gregg are. At being so in character and making in-the-moment comedic situations come to life in the funniest ways, where they're not only so deep in their own characters, but in each other's heads as well. Gregg's instinct here to just completely ignore Tim as he's trying to steamroll him instead of stopping to argue is so perfect. These characters know so well how to get under each other's skin.
He's a usurper. He comes in, he steals my body. He steals the energy.
But
from
lots
the
of
room.
moves.
And Gregg just won't give Tim what he wants. It's a brilliant piece of improv and an incredibly well-oiled machine. They set themselves up in a situation and just let it play out, never seeming like they're trying to be funny. They're just living through this conflict with each other as these characters, and since they are so funny, the scene is funny. That level of performance is rare, and it really separates this from so much of the other comedy out there. And there are a lot of moments like this here. It really feels like something just clicked on this night and everyone was at their best. The Rat Pack segment is another one that jumps out at me for two reasons. One, it's up there in the best tantrums Tim has ever thrown, just performance-wise, as he loses his patience with thinking they're trying to hog the spotlight.
Good. Here we go.
Get out.
Here we go.
Come here. You three. Now, move. This way. Yes, you're going that way. Goodbye.
We all love when Tim becomes untethered and his rage knows no bounds, but this is one of those moments where it feels so undeserved and unprovoked, which makes it so much funnier, especially for how explosive it is.
Get the fuck out. You say one more word, I'll fucking smack you in the mouth. Get the fuck out.
All right.
Get the fuck out.
Oh, wow.
The fuck is the matter? Get the fuck out.
Imagine you were these Rat Pack impersonators and you book what on paper seems like a really great opportunity to sing your songs and do a fun little cheesy interview in character. And then you very quickly realize that one of the hosts doesn't want you there at all, and having him berate you and scream at you to get the fuck out simply for trying to do what you were hired to do. And even before that, to realize the other host has no interest in your act and instead only wants you to do trivia about the Rat Pack movie.
I want to hear about what it was like with Ray Liotta.
It's such a brilliant joke for Gregg's character. A man who hates music and has an unhealthy obsession with every movie in history hires Rat Pack impersonators on the understanding that they would be impersonating the actors that portrayed the Rat Pack in the 1998 Rat Pack TV movie, and is upset when they try to talk about the Rat Pack. This is the kind of joke that really makes me marvel at how genius this show is. So simple, seemingly obvious, but so natural to Gregg's character, and just perfectly just barely reasonable enough that you could see how someone this dumb would be confused by it. And just like the interview segment I already mentioned, the interplay between the Rat Pack guys and Gregg having the dumbest misunderstanding while Tim is becoming annoyed and eventually completely enraged is just so natural. Like a lot of these moments, one might think it was carefully choreographed and scripted to play out this perfectly with planned jokes and beats. But in reality, it's just a very loose experiment that soars because that's how good they are.
I have an earpiece that tells me kind of what's coming next, but we really want it to feel kind of, you know, as it always does, kind of like it's falling apart. There's no point in me having a plan for what I'm going to say. It just has to come out of desperation, come out of like going wherever the mood is taking me, you know.
I do want to jump back and talk about the very start of the special a bit. The special starts with a nice little Easter egg. Not exactly sure how or why this came about initially, but Bobby Valley, the younger brother of Frankie Valley of the Four Seasons, had just recently appeared in the latest season of Decker as the evil Dr. Reaper, who for some reason wears a monogram Bobby Valley robe. Of course, we would see his return in Deck of Cards many years later, but his first appearance as himself was on this special. Continuing in the tradition of folding minor characters from side projects into Oscar specials, we get a glorious rendition of Oscar Fever live from Hemingway's restaurant in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. Very much in the vein of those like a version videos on YouTube where artists will take popular songs and really make them their own, Bobby does his own spin on the Oscar Fever song in his own style with some really fresh twists and some topical lyrical additions.
Timothy Chalamet, we say, how do you do?
I found this really funny and strange, and his storytime segment later on in the special is hilarious.
Jaws 2, that's an older movie, isn't it? Yeah, that was a great movie.
But as if one Oscar Fever rendition wasn't enough, DKR comes on next to perform maybe the most ridiculous version ever, potentially only second to the pre-recorded D4 version years later.
I wish I knew how to quit you.
If Tim comes up with something like Oscar Fever, he always doubles and triples down on it, no matter how bad it is. And this special kicks off with over 5.5 minutes of Oscar carols. I think just how hilarious this DKR Oscar Fever performance is relevant to why On Cinema has such longevity and why it's so rewarding. It has a way of being very self-referential, which is again why it can be hard to recommend. You can jump in at a random point and find it funny because there is so much of it on the surface that speaks for itself, but you wouldn't have anywhere near a full understanding of what's so funny about it to so many of us. Axiom eating leftover cake flop that was on the floor using his hook hand as a fork is an image that I always think back to, and the uninitiated would have no context for everything that goes into why that's so funny to me. Or there's a moment in this special when Tim says the words "it's been" and then pauses and clearly considers singing the Bare Naked Ladies line like he did in the fourth special.
It's been a real interesting experience.
But he doesn't because he doesn't need to. He knows that he just did something without doing anything at all because he's so in sync with this character and the audience is so in tune with it all. He shoots this little look that seems acknowledging of the fact that every hardcore On Cinema head would pick up on a reference that he didn't even overtly make. And for that moment to be as hilarious as it is for a lot of us says a lot about just how deep the comedy here goes. But he doesn't repeat the joke outright because they rarely ever do that. Which is crazy because one of the main features of the show is how in tune with its own history and world building it is. It's not self-referential in the way that many comedy shows become in their later years, when creators are content to coast on rehashing what came before in a lazy attempt to keep something alive, but instead in a way that allows the creators to build on elements that came before and combine them into making something freshly hilarious. In that way, it feels like the show is designed from the ground up for longevity. A shield against that self-referential death nail that many shows slip into in their later years is almost built into the DNA of On Cinema. Everything is so firmly rooted in these characters' behaviors and their expected patterns because they themselves are so creatively limited. I mean, these are the same guys that named their TV show characters by simply taking the last half of each of their names. In Always Sunny, a show that I adore, you get to a point where it's like, okay, we're doing Rum Ham again. Like, remember, you loved that when we did it the first time. With On Cinema, reaching back into its own history is never ever done as a means of key jangling or rehashing something. It's all part of reinforcing and building on this premise that, at least to me, becomes funnier the longer no one in this universe decides it's time to throw in the towel. Part of the joke is how long they've been making the same mistakes. Oscar Fever itself is such a great representation of this. It's the same song that shouldn't have been sung in the first place, continually year after year being reprised in ways that speak to what's going on with these characters. Yeah, they're doing Oscar Fever again, but it evolves with the universe. It's this balance of letting these characters be stuck in their creatively limited ways while still innovating comedically and keeping the show fresh. And in the process, combining elements and adding new ones to constantly create these new, brilliantly layered jokes. So yeah, they're doing Oscar Fever again. And that in itself is funny, especially given the context. But it's also something new, an embarrassing, indulgently long DJ set that clumsily cycles through perfectly random but also overused and cliched movie quotes as it drops.
You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Of course, my personal favorite of which being this one.
Great ass!
What Tim wants to be doing is DJing, but he's trapped himself in needing to theme everything that he does around the already flawed premise of this show. Always having to pretend everything that he does is somehow related to movies. The result is such a bizarre, corny mashup of elements that hilariously don't work together, because of course they don't. The character work surrounding it is also so great. The first shot we get of Gregg in this special is him looking absolutely pissed off because Tim is doing this, which is such a funny detail knowing how he feels about music and about Tim at this current point. And the fact that he yet again is there putting up with this type of thing. One of my favorite on cinema tweets also ties into this, in which Gregg writes DKR equals dead kid's revenge, which is just such a fucked up joke for him to make. Gregg being annoyed by the performance is an expected joke that keeps us grounded in what we know about this world. But what's unexpected and fresh is the performance itself, and most of all, Tim's absolute animosity towards Axiom and Manuel, and the fact that he almost immediately after performing with them announces that he's breaking up the group.
That was probably, maybe could be the last performance of DKR.
One, this is confirmation that Tim was in some way lying about playing to a big crowd in Dubai, because he says this was the first time that DKR had ever played to a big audience. But two, it's such a curveball that seemingly comes out of nowhere. It leaves you surprised trying to retrace the steps of why this is happening. This show is so good at, again, while remaining grounded by these characters, surprising you in big ways. Tim is a big part of that. Gregg's character is so stubborn and steadfast that it's endlessly funny to see him bring the same reliable ingredients into every situation he's thrown into. That's the constant. But Tim is always throwing curveballs like this. He swings wildly from one persona or mood or opinion to another, which is expected as beside his few ugly core traits, he's kind of an empty vessel trying to figure out what's going to make him whole. But that's the thing, he always acts so unpredictably but never ever randomly. That's an infinitely harder and more impressive kind of character to conceive of and write, especially to make work within a universe where overall continuity is so respected. It would be far easier to portray a randomly chaotic person that you can bend to whatever jokes you want to make. But a lot more care has gone into constructing this character and allowing us to really understand him and his decisions, to the point where you can really get to know him as a three-dimensional character while still allowing for crazy swings that keep the show fresh and innovate comedically. It's always grounded in something. The new erotic massage video on the High Network seems like a complete departure at first. My first reaction was, what the hell is he doing? This is so weird. But you can trace it back to everything that's happened and come to an understanding of Tim's thought process and why he's doing this. It ties in directly with the relationship problems that were revealed in Tony's therapy sessions. I think that's a really unique character that sort of can only exist by way of how perfectly they've set up this whole sandbox. Anyway, though I still don't quite understand why Tim later tells Gregg that he broke up DKR for his sake.
Well, I told you I broke up the band for you, and I'll tell you about that later.
Maybe someone else can help me understand that. It's our first immediate indication in this special that not all is well in Tinseltown, and Tim feels betrayed by everyone in his life following the events of the trial.
I don't forget some things with in that department is why we're shutting things down.
It's ironic because his issue with Manuel is that he didn't fully follow through on committing perjury for him, even though he got pretty damn close, which is a lot more than I'd do for any of my friends. As I'm sure you'd guess, I'd rank The Trial of Tim Heidecker as the most brilliant piece of comedy I personally have ever seen. I'm not sure how anything could compete, really, so this special had a lot of pressure as its immediate follow-up. And I think the way it deals with the aftermath of that experience for these characters is fantastic. In that area, it goes hand in hand with the following season, which is one of my favorite mini arcs of the whole show, and arguably my favorite season overall. I'll probably have to do a video talking about why exactly I think season 10 is so strong, but all the groundwork is laid here in this special. What Tim did was horrible, and he was handed a miracle in that mistrial. And just like the death of those teenagers, or Tom Cruise Heidecker, or any of the many deaths on Tim or Gregg's hands, the hilarity's not in what happened, but how these terrible people react to it. And the way Tim is handling it is outright disgusting, in the funniest way possible. First off with how he's treating the people around him.
And I want to thank Mark Proch as much as he's crossed me. Gregg's here, and people are sort of like wondering why.
Mark and Gregg for actually doing the right thing and testifying against him, even if Gregg's motives for doing so may have also been self-centered. And Manuel, Axiom, and Joe for literally trying to cover up for him, but doing so in the wrong way or failing to. He's trying to pretend to care about the people that died, but he just can't fully muster up the performance.
I want to thank the Electric Sun 20. Or the 19, I should say.
The words he chooses to describe such a tragedy are that it was an interesting experience. He says that the Electric Sun 20 are the reason we're here tonight, which makes no sense to say in the first place. If anything, their death would be the reason Tim wouldn't be able to do an Oscar special, had justice been served. Even the in memoriam tribute is incredibly insensitive and fucked up.
Known you since I was 17, carved our names in the maple tree. I wish you was in a heart.
I love how they found a way to both butcher something that actually happens on the real Oscars and simultaneously in a roundabout way disrespect Tim's victims. Imagine being a family member of one of these victims, seeing Tim memorialize them for brownie points and feigned sympathy with, and set to this fucking song.
I'm all about you.
But the craziest thing here is that Tim is such a narcissist that he's actually leaning into the whole thing and wearing it as a badge of honor. The photo in the intro of Tim is literally a photo of him on trial for murder. Why in the world, of all photos, would that be the one he chose? It's clearly because he loves the fact that this happened. He's proud of it, which he proved by doing potentially the most insensitive thing someone could do in this situation, bragging about winning the trial and going so far as to stage another one. He's so obsessed with the fact that he got off scot-free that instead of being traumatized by the experience as any normal person would be, he wants to do it again, almost suggesting that he thought the whole experience was fun or he got some kind of thrill out of it. He loved cosplaying as a lawyer and can't seem to wrap his head around the fact that his freedom was because of a mistrial, not the result of him being good at lawyering.
I'm going to win, like I'd win every trial I do. The
So it's
trial
gonna
of
be a
George Lucas
mistrial?
started.
So he wants to do it again. He wants to keep living in that world and pretending he's some legal force to be reckoned with. Of course, we see this play out long after the special as he literally decides he has the qualifications to run for district attorney in the same district in which he was tried for murder. But this is when it was made crystal clear Tim would be doubling down on all of this. The fake trial centers around the idea that the movie The Last Jedi stole the concept for a code-breaking character from Decker. First off, it's part of the great running joke that Tim and Gregg always think people are ripping off Decker as if anyone would have even seen it.
That's very similar to Decker. You see a lot of these new movies coming out that have sort of that tip of the hat to
Well, it's
the
more
Decker
than a tip
series.
of the hat when they're taking names of our characters and putting them in the title of the movie.
But the really funny part of this for me is that the person that they're putting on trial for this is George Lucas.
Lucas, we're coming for you. You've crossed me, and like everybody else who crosses me, you will learn to pay.
Just the absolute absurdity of hiring a George Lucas impersonator and putting him on trial for a movie that he had absolutely nothing to do with. What's more, as it plays out, yelling at him about whether or not he directed Star Wars and having him dodge the question.
You were directed the Star Wars movies?
Well, first of all,
Yes or no, Mr. Lucas?
under this forum,
Yes or no?
The guilty verdict comes in after he finally answers the question. No proof, no actual attempt at recreating anything resembling a real trial. It just shows how easy Tim thinks it is to win cases. Other than the premise, just how hard they go at the impersonator, and some great moments like Tim's classic line flubbing and Joe's performance as the judge.
Judge, can I get a ruling on this?
I'm going to hold you in contempt. I do not even have to go and take a recess.
It's not the funniest segment for me and how it plays out moment to moment, but the idea of this becomes more interesting to me the more I think about it. And it's weirdly an example I would give to illustrate a factor in On Cinema's greatness. Again, this show is better than anything out there at taking its own lore and bringing it back and expanding on it and creating something new out of it. And this fake trial has massive character implications for Tim. But it really makes me think about how layered this universe is and the fascinating way in which they're playing with perspective. It's something that I find sticks out to me a lot in the best of Tim's comedy specifically. Like there's an episode of Tim and Eric Night Live that I've always been really fond of for how it reframes the entire show to make an entirely new kind of comedy out of the same events. It starts with the ending of a normal Night Live episode, and then as if the camera was accidentally left on, the show becomes a very serious and argumentative discussion between the writers about how the show is going.
I wanted to talk to you about this earlier, but it's a little awkward with the chocolate show being so good, but I haven't been happy with the way the show's been going since the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it shows.
Producer Bob Odenkirk comes in to help out, saying he didn't realize they were actually trying to make something good.
The show's not that good. Why Not Live is terrible.
Well, I don't know. It's terrible.
Well, on a scale of 1 to terrible, it's...
But what do you,
Okay, let's just see if
compared
we
to
can...
what, Letterman?
Okay, now what?
They're examining content that seemingly takes place in some bizarre alternate universe in this very candid way from a real-world perspective.
There's you. Now look, watch what happens here. This is a technical glitch.
This is a big mistake.
Look at that. That's not good.
That's bent. That's all.
No, that isn't. That's you.
No, that's us as
Now, I wanna
producers not
explain
making the right
something.
choices,
I want to
not-
explain something to you. Look at this.
Suggesting that the real creators are legitimately trying and failing to create something not at all like the final product we had seen up until that point. There's this one moment where Bob is showing the team clips from the show and commenting on what a disaster it's all been, and we see this.
It was just like a Heathkit.
This is
Did you know the
unprofessional.
camera was on you?
That's
No,
unprofessional.
no, because the tally lights.
No, it's not the
aren't
tally
on.
light problem.
Yeah, if the dude, it was
Let me-
on.
let me-
You just, all you have to do is sit there. All you have to do is fucking sit there. Excuse me. All you have to do is fucking sit there and not fucking
I'm
act like a
fucking
clown.
trying the best I.
No, you're not. You're fucking around. You're making it a joke.
These strange, uncanny movements and behaviors are a staple of their style of comedy, but in this moment it's plainly put into real-world context. What was just a goofy throwaway detail from an earlier episode, in which the joke essentially lies in the fact that it exists in the first place, is now being framed as something to be taken seriously as a sincere attempt. Why would Eric be standing there and moving his body in such a way? Suddenly the perspective on his strange actions switches from essentially a cartoon character acting silly in a world where this type of behavior is commonplace, to something that invites you to actually question why a man trying his best to be professional who was supposed to be sitting there acting normal is for some reason moving his body like some kind of demented puppet. It's not one-to-one at all because On Cinema is far more subtle and realistic in the first place, so there isn't nearly as much room to be that structurally subversive. But I think this general idea sums up an element of what makes the trial, and by extension this fake trial, so interesting to me the more I think about it. It plays with its own structure and perspective in interesting ways, and because On Cinema is never too far in the realm of fantasy, it does this kind of thing a lot more elegantly. Trace this back to Heidecker. A hilariously bad web series is one thing when looked at from a real-world perspective. An honest attempt by real Tim and Gregg to make something deliberately bad. It's another from the perspective of the On Cinema universe in which it's meant to be taken seriously, an honest attempt by their characters to make something good. But it's another thing entirely when made relevant to a very matter-of-fact examination of the events of this universe in the trial. One from the perspective of serious people that, while still in this universe, share the real-world perspective that we would have on those events in real life. A fictional trial constructed from the perspective of a real-life trial. Then to have a fake trial inspired by the fake real trial in which Heidecker was used as evidence that centers around the IP of Heidecker. On Cinema is so great at layering all these perspectives to the point that it becomes really interesting to sift through, and it's almost impossible that any given joke in this universe will have fewer than 3 dimensions. Post-trial, we're into the era of how that serious examination of all this insanity affects this universe from the same perspective we had pre-trial, and part of that is the defendant of the trial having fun pretending to do it again while yelling at the fake judge about the real judge that was simply trying to bring justice for the families of 19 victims.
What do you think I am, Rossetti the Rat? I'm not gonna take this. Now answer the question. What do you think? What are you, Sismic? Get him to fall in line.
But it just wouldn't be an Oscar special without adding at least one more victim to the ever-growing list. The most memorable and my favorite part of this special is Mark's accident, and how it thrusts the whole night into absolute chaos, culminating in the weirdest ending to any special to date.
Mark? You get Mark? Hey, Rummy. Take it. All right, we wanna... Mark?
The way the accident plays out is so perfect, because watching it back you can see it happening in real time, but everyone's too absorbed in their own bullshit to notice. I love that it turns out to kind of be both Tim and Gregg's fault. They bring him out in the suit and just leave him there while they tee up another segment. At one point you literally hear Mark choking and gasping for air, and Tim just tells him to be quiet.
Time ever done before where we see Jaws, it's quiet.
Then, while Mark is sitting there in this ridiculous costume, that by the way doesn't even resemble anything from the scene he's meant to be recreating, completely unable to breathe, Gregg's segment starts. And it ends up being the worst possible time to air what's probably Gregg's most pointless segment ever.
I walk in to one of movies' greatest locations, Universal Studios, where so many great movies were filmed, and of course, the greatest of them all, Jaws.
In his Oscar on location segments, he at least does visit the place where the Oscars are held. Jaws was filmed in Martha's Vineyard, but Gregg is acting like we're getting an inside look at the production history of Jaws by visiting the Universal Studios theme park, a park that literally anyone can go to. And he doesn't even go in. It's just a painfully long montage of him standing in line to buy a ticket. Why anyone would think this would be interesting or useful is beyond understanding. And the thing is, one can't help but think that were Gregg a little more judicious in editing down the footage of him standing in line, Mark's condition would have been caught sooner, and he could have been saved from this. It's especially funny given Gregg would go on to take advantage of him and prop him up like a puppet while he's in a coma, but we'll get to that in the next one. I just love the fact that both Tim's self-absorption and Gregg's terrible editing had a hand in Mark's accident. And what follows is just long stretches of silent panic and horror as the paramedics arrive and people are racing around. This atmosphere is so well realized, simultaneously disturbing and hilarious as Chaplins Express and the Vape Lounge take on the glow of flashing police lights and Gregg is just silently putting Super Oscars winners on the board. I really thought Mark was going to die watching this, and it was actually kind of intense in the moment. One of those sequences that pulls your brain in two directions as you're kind of both horrified and amused. Mark is that classic tragic character that means well and just gets kicked at every turn and kicked again when he's down. And this takes it so much further than ever before, suddenly ramping up the tragedy and peril by a considerable amount. It almost shouldn't be funny, because he's the least deserving person. But because of the history between all these characters and the fact that Mark just keeps coming back into this awful world and getting hurt for some reason, it's just so hilarious. But then you find out he's not actually dead. Ironically, like Gregg, Tim was getting some bad intel. The fact that Tim immediately upon finding out Mark isn't dead starts talking about contracts that were signed and how he's not legally liable is so perfect.
Mark signed a waiver in terms of if something should happen, that there is a lot of risk involved in this business. And he is an impressionist, is a stunt man in a way, and these are certain sort of acting stunts that he does.
Not only because it's hilariously inappropriate and shows how little Tim cares about anyone but himself, but because it's more insight into his mindset after the trial, covering his bases but also still clearly getting off on his new lawyer persona. He makes it all about himself, which is typical, like he's more so just annoyed when he thinks that another person died in his orbit, because of how it would affect him.
I can't deal with that kind of shit anymore. I don't want to make it about me.
And Gregg, who now has a long history of not giving a shit when Mark gets hurt.
But Mark's in very grave danger and not likely to pull through.
He's pretty tough. I think he'll be fine.
Is one of the highlights in his reaction to the incident. Slinking around, pointing fingers.
He's not a very emotive guy to begin with.
It seems like he's more upset with this derailing his Oscar coverage than anything. Him saying that the ambulances are going to have trouble because all of the streets are shut down for the Oscars is such a great detail, showing what a big deal he thinks the Oscars are in his mind. The Oscar special is being filmed in Culver City, which is nowhere near Hollywood. I don't think it'll be a problem. Most importantly, he delivers the absolutely iconic line of, "We'll do some super Oscars until the paramedics get here."
We'll do some super Oscars until
yeah,
the paramedics get here.
Always in moments like this, finding a way to remind us how stupid this whole thing was in the first place. It's also quite interesting that they had an in memoriam package just ready to go for Mark. Of course, with the same "Known You Since I Was 17" song. It's actually hilarious how many of these there have now been in the show's history. Also, just the detail that the video says, "May he finally meet WC in heaven." So good. Now, I'm sure this isn't the case, but if I were to put on my tinfoil hat, signs 2002, hour 46 minutes, I would say, last time we saw Mark, he was testifying against Tim. Tim said he would fuck him up and tried to attack him. Then a Tim that now feels like he can get away with anything made him sign a form that said if anything happened to him, he wasn't legally responsible. Then heard him choking and told him to be quiet. Let Gregg play a way too long segment while he was choking, and then had an in memoriam package just ready to go for him. Seems like Tim might have tried to kill him. I actually don't think this is the case because Tim seems genuinely concerned after the accident, but hey, if it came out somehow that this was orchestrated, I don't think it would be a stretch based off the evidence.
Well, with props that you rented, especially.
I did not have, hey, remember this? This is what I like to call a get out of jail free card, because this, Mark signed it, and I have evidence that he signed it.
Either way, it takes all of the air out of the room, and everything from that point on gets kind of dark and abstract, and it becomes one of those pieces of this universe that is so artistically inspired and singular. Even after it's revealed that Mark is alive, it feels like everyone is so done and just wants to go home. But the show must go on, and Gregg has an incredible finale planned. This is without a doubt the most absurd and bizarre finale they've ever done. Joe Estevez dressed like a judge reading off of a terribly written script about how aliens have found a way to simulate popcorn on Mars against an inflatable alien with pre-recorded dialogue from a man that at this very moment is in the hospital in a coma that will last for a full year is something that truly feels like it could only ever happen on this show.
Take me to meet the great one, your leader, Humphrey Bogart.
Bogey?
I always like to call out those moments, and this is definitely one of them. No one else is as good at constructing these situations that are so infinitely random and weird, but are thoroughly justified by previous events and context. And it just gets better as the scene wraps and the music just won't stop playing as Tim pleads with the crew to turn it off. It's such an odd and funny predicament for a drunken man at the absolute end of his rope to be in.
Listen, thank you, turn that off. Here's the real deal. Turn that off. Turn it off. Turn it off.
That came out pretty good.
It even made Tim break pretty hard.
I mean, can somebody turn it off?
It just feels like such a true disaster. Everyone is so tired. The night was such a failure, and this anxiety-inducing droning is just loudly continuing over all of it. It really feels like a bad dream, and I think this is one of those moments in On Cinema that I would point to as crossing the line into some kind of strange performance art. Usually these things end in some kind of fit of rage or some kind of tragedy, but in this one, the big disaster happens somewhat early, and I really love that because we get to sit with the chaos and the emotions that everyone's going through long enough until it just gets all loopy and weird, and then just kind of peters out.
And I love the Rat Pack, and I love Joe! Get over here, Joe! I'm so sorry that everything bad happened tonight. And Mark is gonna be fine. He's gonna be just fine. He just ran out of air for a while. Good night.
It's definitely the only Oscar special that ends with Tim drunkenly hugging and apologizing to everyone, except Gregg, and saying everything's gonna be fine. I think it's a really interesting note to leave things on. It's almost more unsettling in a strange way than Tim, say, screaming in the face of a very elderly man like the last 2 years. Anyway, speaking of droning, I think I've talked about this long enough. Summary, On Cinema's really good. If you haven't watched it, go subscribe to the High Network and watch it, and maybe even subscribe to this channel if you want to. See you at the 6th annual.